Chapter 1. The quiet before the shift. Chris Green had always believed that silence told the truth faster than words. That belief had served him well in most areas of his life. Finance, work, friendships, even love. Silence revealed patterns. It showed you what people reached for when no one was watching. It showed you what they protected, what they neglected, and what they were willing to let drift. Lately, Denise had been drifting. Not in any dramatic movie trailer way. There were no slammed doors, no secretive phone calls taken outside, no lipstick stains or missed nights. It was smaller than that. Quieter. More dangerous. It was the way her phone lit up during dinner and she smiled before she even checked who it was. Chris noticed things. He always had. He noticed how the smile lingered just a fraction longer than it used to. How she angled the screen away without realizing she was doing it. How her sorry work stuff came faster now. Pre-packaged. Like a reflex she'd practiced. He didn't say anything. Patience wasn't ignorance. Patience was restraint. At 28, Chris knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. He wasn't the guy who hovered. He wasn't the guy who scrolled through someone else's phone while they were in the shower. He wasn't the guy who interrogated tone or punctuation like it was evidence in a trial. He was the guy who balanced his parents' checkbook at 8 years old while other kids were learning long division. He was the kid who made his first investment at 10 and didn't tell anyone because the point wasn't applause, it was growth. While his friends learned which bars had the cheapest drinks, Chris learned compound interest. Not because he was better than them, because he liked stability. He liked knowing that if something fell apart, it wouldn't be because he hadn't been paying attention. That was the irony. He paid attention to everything. Denise was in marketing at a mid-sized firm across town. Chris worked in operations for a logistics company. Two separate worlds that intersected neatly at 5:30 every evening when they met back at the apartment they'd shared for nearly 2 years. 3 years together. Long enough to stop pretending. Long enough to talk about the future without flinching. They talked about marriage, kids, neighborhoods they liked, what mattered and what didn't. Betrayal mattered. Everything else was negotiable. Chris believed love wasn't perfection. It was acceptance, flaws, habits, annoying tendencies and all, so long as the flaw wasn't betrayal. That was his line. Clean. Final. One strike. Lately, though, he felt like he was standing on a platform watching a train approach that no one else could see yet. Denise's new coworker had arrived 6 months ago. At first, she'd mentioned him the way people mention office plants or broken printers. New guy started today. Seems nice. Then, he's still learning the systems. Asked me a million questions. Then, he's actually pretty funny. Chris had smiled. Nodded. Asked neutral questions. That was normal. People talked about their coworkers. What wasn't normal was the texting. It started with brief exchanges. Work emergency. Quick question. Can you believe this client? Then the pauses grew longer. Denise would disappear into her phone the way people disappear into books, fully absorbed, time slipping sideways. Chris would be talking, and she'd still be there physically, but her attention had moved on. That hurt more than he expected. Not because he thought she was cheating. He didn't. Not really. But he recognized trajectories. He recognized when attention shifted before behavior followed. He also recognized that if he said anything, if he voiced the discomfort curling quietly in his chest, he would be labeled insecure. And insecurity, once spoken, was a bell that couldn't be unrung. He refused to beg someone to see him. If 3 years hadn't earned him respect, begging wouldn't either. The lunchroom at work smelled like burnt coffee and microwaved leftovers. Chris sat at the same table he always did, methodically unwrapping his sandwich, when a shadow fell across the surface. "You're quiet today," Melissa said. She'd worked with Chris since orientation. Same start date. Same initial confusion about the printer that jammed every third page. Over the years, they'd settled into an easy professional rhythm. Melissa was kind without being invasive, observant without being nosy, happily married, which mattered. "Just tired," Chris said automatically. She raised an eyebrow. "That's not your tired face." He exhaled through his nose, looked around the room. The break room was half full, but no one was close enough to overhear without trying. He lowered his voice. "I've been thinking about proposing," he said. Melissa's expression softened. "Okay, and lately something feels off." She didn't interrupt. "There's a guy at her office," Chris continued. "I don't think she's cheating. I really don't. But she's spending a lot of time talking to him, texting, smiling at her phone." Melissa tilted her head slightly. "Do you think she loves you?" "Yes," Chris said without hesitation. Then quieter. "I just don't know if she remembers to choose me right now." Silence stretched between them. Then Melissa smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. "I've got an idea," she said. Chris listened carefully as she laid it out. Simple, controlled, boring in the best way. No traps. No jealousy games. No accusations. Just symmetry. "You do exactly what she's doing," Melissa said. "Nothing inappropriate. No secrets. Just presence." "And your husband?" Chris asked. "I'll tell him," she said easily. "He'll probably help me pick memes." That got a laugh out of him. a real one. The tightness in his chest eased. If she's not doing anything wrong, Melissa added, then there's no problem. And if there is a problem, well, then it was already there. Chris nodded. That made sense. He wasn't interested in two sets of rules. They were either together or they weren't. That evening, when Denise looked up from her phone and smiled at him across the kitchen, Chris smiled back, unchanged. And for the first time in weeks, he felt steady again. Not because things were fixed, but because he wasn't abandoning himself to keep the peace. Chapter 2, Rules Without Names. The first text Chris sent Melissa felt oddly formal, like a memo he'd accidentally typed into the wrong window. Chris, did you see the updated shipping forecast? He stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary, then slid the phone face down on his desk as if it might explode. Across the office, the usual hum carried on. Keyboards clacking, someone laughing too loudly near the copier, the HVAC unit rattling like it had opinions. Nothing about the world had shifted, except it had. Melissa's reply came 3 minutes later. Melissa, I did. It's a mess. Whoever approved that timeline should be sentenced to organizing the supply closet. Chris smiled despite himself. The tension in his shoulders eased by a notch. That was it. That was the whole exchange. No secrets. No hearts. No ellipses heavy with implication. Just two co-workers talking about work. At lunch, Melissa plopped down across from him with her salad and an air of exaggerated seriousness. So, she said, lowering her voice theatrically, I have been informed by my husband that my meme game is adequate but inconsistent. He will be assisting. Chris snorted. Tell him I appreciate the support. Boundaries remain intact, she added. We are professionals. Devastating, Chris said. I was hoping for scandal. She grinned. Disappoint someone else. That night, Chris came home at his usual time. He set his keys in the bowl by the door, hung his jacket, and washed his hands before starting dinner. Routine mattered. It grounded him. Denise was on the couch, phone in hand, legs tucked under her. She looked up when he entered the living room. Hey, she said, smiling. How was work? Busy, he replied easily. You? Same. New guy messed up a report and I had to walk him through it again. Chris nodded. He didn't comment. He didn't ask follow-ups. He cooked. They ate. They talked about neutral things, what to watch, whose turn it was to buy groceries, whether the weather app was lying again. At one point, his phone buzzed. Chris glanced down, then back up. Denise noticed. It wasn't immediate. It was the second glance that caught her attention. The way his mouth curved faintly. The way he typed a short response and set the phone aside without ceremony. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The next few days settled into a pattern so subtle it would have been invisible to anyone not living inside it. Chris didn't change his tone with Denise. He didn't withdraw affection. He kissed her hello, asked about her day, slept beside her at night with the same steady presence he always had. But there were now moments, small, unclaimed moments, where his attention shifted. A lunch break spent trading dry jokes about office politics. A quick text exchange while waiting for a meeting to start. A meme about spreadsheets that made him laugh out loud in the break room. It wasn't that he was hiding anything. It was that he wasn't broadcasting. Denise, meanwhile, felt something unfamiliar settling under her skin. It wasn't jealousy. Not yet. It was static. Chris had always been predictable in the best way. Reliable. Focused. When he smiled at his phone, it was usually because his mother had sent a picture of the neighbor's dog again, or because he'd spotted a market fluctuation he found satisfying. Now, the smiles were different. Lighter. More frequent. She noticed them the way you notice a ticking sound in a quiet room, only after it's been there long enough to become impossible to ignore. One evening, she watched him from the kitchen as he stood at the counter, phone in hand, typing with an ease that felt new. Who's that? She asked, aiming for casual. Chris looked up, genuinely surprised. Oh, Melissa. Melissa. My coworker. I've mentioned her before. Denise searched her memory. The married one? Yep. Chris set the phone down and turned back to chopping vegetables. Just work stuff, he added, tone neutral. Denise nodded. Oh, okay. The word sat strangely in her mouth. At her office, the new guy, Evan, leaned over her desk with a grin. You're the only one who explains things without making me feel like an idiot. Denise laughed reflexively. Low bar, apparently. Her phone buzzed. A text from Evan. She didn't open it right away. Across town, Chris reviewed an investment report and sent Melissa a screenshot. Chris, this made my eye twitch. Melissa, yes, the rare technical term. He chuckled quietly. At home later that night, Denise watched him laugh at his phone again. The static grew louder. She tried to tell herself it was nothing. That she was imagining patterns where none existed. That Chris was allowed to have friends. Of course he was. Still, when he set his phone down and met her gaze, she smiled back. But this time, the smile felt practiced. Everything okay? He asked. Yeah, she said quickly. Just tired. Chris nodded. He accepted the answer the way he accepted most things, with respect. And that somehow made it worse. Because for the first time since they'd met, Denise felt the unsettling awareness that Chris wasn't chasing her attention. He wasn't pulling away. He was simply not reaching. And she didn't know when she'd stopped noticing how much space she'd been taking. Chapter 3. Static becomes noise. Denise first noticed the change on a Wednesday, which annoyed her more than it should have. Wednesdays were supposed to be neutral days. Not the relief of Friday, not the dread of Monday, just a placeholder in the week where nothing important was meant to happen. You moved through them on autopilot, except she couldn't. She stood in the bathroom, brushing her teeth, watching Chris in the mirror as he tied his tie with the same precise movements he'd always used. There was nothing new about the routine. The tie was navy. The knot was clean. His expression was calm, focused. And yet, his phone buzzed on the counter. Chris glanced at it, smiled. Not broadly, not secretly, just warmly, and finished tying his tie before picking it up. Denise watched the smile fade back into neutrality as he typed a short reply and slipped the phone into his pocket. "You're in a good mood," she said, toothpaste foam making the words slightly ridiculous. Chris met her eyes in the mirror. "Am I?" She shrugged. "Seems like it. Guess that's not a crime yet," he said lightly. She laughed because the line was funny, and because laughing felt easier than examining the small flare of irritation that had sparked in her chest. At work, Evan leaned against her desk again. "I brought coffee," he announced. "As a peace offering." "For what?" Denise asked. "For asking you questions you already answered yesterday." She accepted the cup. "Bribery works." Noted. Her phone buzzed. A text from Chris. She blinked at it, surprised. "Chris, random question. Do you prefer the Thai place or the Italian one near the apartment?" She smiled automatically. "Denise, Thai, obviously." "Chris, correct answer." She stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary. That was normal, sweet even. So why did it feel reactive? The thought bothered her the rest of the day. That evening, they sat on opposite ends of the couch, a familiar movie playing in the background. Denise scrolled through her phone, half watching the screen, half tracking Chris in her peripheral vision. He wasn't on his phone constantly. That was the thing. He was selective. When his phone buzzed, he checked it. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he didn't. He never angled the screen away from her. Never hid it. Never rushed to respond like something might be lost if he didn't. The casualness of it unsettled her. She set her phone down with more force than necessary. "You okay?" Chris asked. "Yeah," she said quickly. "Just tired of staring at screens all day." He nodded, accepting the explanation without probing. That should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like being given too much space. Later that night, Denise lay awake while Chris slept beside her, breathing slow and even. She stared at the ceiling, replaying moments she hadn't thought twice about before. How often had she pulled away to answer Evan's texts? How many conversations had she half heard while her attention lived somewhere else? She hadn't meant to do it. That was the problem. At lunch the next day, Melissa slid into the seat across from Chris, eyebrow raised. "So," she said, "how's the weather at home?" Chris chewed thoughtfully before answering. "Cloudy. No storms yet." She nodded. "And you?" "Clear," he said. "I'm good." She studied him for a moment. "You're not enjoying this too much, are you?" He huffed a quiet laugh. "No, I don't like games. This isn't a game." "I know," he said. "That's why it's working." That night, Denise couldn't keep it in anymore. They were cleaning up after dinner, Chris rinsing plates while she dried them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." She hesitated. "You've been texting a lot lately." Chris set a plate in the rack and turned to face her fully. "Have I?" The lack of defensiveness threw her. "More than usual," she said. I noticed." He nodded slowly. "Okay. That's it?" she asked, a little sharper than she intended. "What would you like it to be?" he asked gently. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. What did she want? An apology? A reassurance? Promise? "I guess I just wanted to know why." Chris considered her for a moment, eyes steady. "I've been talking to a coworker," he said. "About work. About random things." Her chest tightened. "A woman." "Yes. And you don't think that's, I don't know, weird?" He tilted his head slightly. "Do you?" The question landed between them, heavy and unavoidable. Denise's mind raced. "I mean, no. Not inherently. I just what?" he prompted. She exhaled, frustrated. "It makes me feel uneasy." Chris nodded. "I understand." "You do?" "Yes." Silence stretched. Then he added, evenly, "That's how I've been feeling for a while." Her stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said carefully, "that I didn't realize how much attention could shift without anyone meaning harm, until I felt it." Her pulse thudded in her ears. "You're talking about Evan." "I'm talking about us," Chris said, "and the space between where we are and where our attention goes." Denise swallowed. "So this is what? A lesson?" "No," he said firmly. "It's just symmetry." The word stung. "You didn't tell me it bothered you," she said. "You didn't ask," he replied gently. And I didn't want to argue about whether my feelings were valid. She stared at him, realization creeping in. You're not doing anything I'm not doing, she said slowly. He nodded once. Exactly. The kitchen felt too small suddenly. So what happens now? She asked. Chris held her gaze, calm and unyielding. Now, he said, we decide whether we're playing by the same rules or different ones. Denise felt the weight of the question settle in her chest. For the first time in months, the static wasn't background noise. It was impossible to ignore. Chapter 4. The mirror, held steady. Denise didn't sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling fan as it cut slow circles through the dark, replaying Chris's words until they lost their edges and became something worse. Truths that refused to soften. Symmetry. The word had lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs. She hadn't meant for things to go this way. That was the thought she kept circling back to, as if intention alone could rewrite impact. Evan had been easy, new, curious, grateful for her help. The attention had slipped in quietly, like water through a crack. She hadn't guarded the space because she'd assumed it was infinite. Chris, on the other hand, had always treated space like something shared, something finite, something earned. When morning came, she was already exhausted. Chris moved through the kitchen with the same calm efficiency as always, pouring coffee, checking the weather, glancing at his phone only once before setting it aside. She watched him over the rim of her mug. Did you sleep? He asked. A little, she lied. He nodded, accepting it without comment. That, too, felt like part of the problem now, how easily he accepted what she offered without pushing, without testing. They left for work separately, the door closing with its usual quiet click behind him. Denise spent the day distracted, her focus fracturing every time her phone buzzed. Evan texted. She didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her replies were shorter, more deliberate. At lunch, her coworkers laughed about something unrelated, but Denise barely heard them. Her thoughts kept returning to the kitchen, to Chris's steady gaze, to the way he'd said, I'm not doing anything you're not doing without accusation. That evening, she beat him home. She paced the living room, straightening things that didn't need straightening, her nerves humming. When the door finally opened and Chris stepped inside, she felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Hey, he said. Hey, she replied. They stood there for a moment, neither moving, the space between them charged. Can we talk? She asked. Chris set his keys down carefully. Sure. They sat at opposite ends of the couch, the distance deliberate now instead of incidental. I've been thinking about what you said, Denise began. About symmetry. He nodded. Okay. I didn't realize how much time I was spending, how much attention I was giving, until I felt what it was like to be on the other side of it. Chris didn't interrupt. I never cheated on you, she said quickly. I would never do that. I know, he replied. I didn't accuse you of that. She swallowed. But I crossed something. Yes. The simple agreement made her chest tighten. I didn't think it mattered, she admitted, because I knew I loved you, because I wasn't planning to leave. Chris leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. Intent doesn't cancel effect. I know that now. Silence stretched. The fan hummed softly overhead. So what are we doing here? Denise asked finally. Are you trying to show me how it feels? No, Chris said. I'm showing you what it is. She frowned. What's the difference? The difference is that I'm not asking you to change out of guilt, he said calmly. I'm asking you to notice out of respect. Something in his tone, steady, unmoved, made her heart pound harder. You went to the guest room last night, she said. That felt dramatic. Chris's expression didn't change. It felt necessary. Necessary for what? For clarity, he said. For both of us. She stared at him. So you're just, what, waiting to see what I do? I'm not waiting, he replied. I'm observing. That word landed like a verdict. You're not going to fight for me? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Chris looked at her then, really looked, and something unreadable passed through his eyes. I fought for us by showing up every day for 3 years, he said quietly. I'm not going to beg you to choose me. The room felt too small again. If the last 3 years haven't earned me your respect, he continued, then we might not be walking toward the same future. Her throat tightened. That sounds like an ultimatum. It's not, he said. It's a boundary. She pressed her palms into her knees, grounding herself. I didn't mean to take that space, she said. It just happened. Chris nodded once. That's usually how it happens. So what do you want from me? She asked. I want us to play by the same rules, he said. All the time. Not just when it's convenient. And if I say I'll stop talking to him? She asked. He considered that. I don't want you to do it because I asked. I want you to do it because you understand why. Denise felt the weight of that settle over her. She thought of Evan's easy grin, of the harmlessness she'd assigned to something that wasn't hers alone to define, of how quickly she'd dismissed the idea that attention itself could be a currency. I didn't protect what was ours, she said softly. Chris didn't argue. I need to understand how I let that happen, she continued. So it doesn't ever happen again. He studied her face, searching for something, ownership, maybe, accountability without panic. Take the time you need, he said. I'll be in the guest room tonight. She flinched. You're not coming back to bed? Not yet. That hurt more than anger would have. As he stood and walked down the hall, Denise remained on the couch, staring at the place where he'd been sitting. For the first time, she understood that love wasn't just about not betraying someone in the obvious ways. It was about guarding the quiet ones too. And she knew exactly who she needed to talk to next. Her grandmother had been married for 56 years. If anyone understood how erosion happened before collapse, it was her. Chapter 5. The Long View. Denise's grandmother lived in a small blue house at the edge of town, the kind with creaky steps and a porch swing that had learned the rhythm of decades. The paint was chipped in places, the railing worn smooth where hands had rested over years of coming and going. It had never occurred to Denise to see that as neglect. It was maintenance. Her grandmother, Evelyn, answered the door before Denise knocked twice, as if she'd been waiting. You look like you're carrying something heavy, Evelyn said, stepping aside. Denise's throat tightened. I am. Then come in, her grandmother replied. No one should carry things like that standing on a porch. The house smelled like lemon polish and something warm baking, habit, not performance. Denise sank into the familiar armchair in the living room, hands twisting in her lap. Evelyn settled into the chair across from her, folding her hands calmly. She didn't rush. She never had. So, she said, tell me what you're trying not to tell your friends. That did it. Denise laughed once, sharp and brittle, then pressed her fingers to her eyes. How did you know? Because you came here instead, Evelyn said gently. And because women don't bring gossip to people who know the whole story of their lives. Denise exhaled slowly. I think I almost ruined something good, she said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Almost is a very specific word. I didn't cheat, Denise said quickly. I would never. But I let someone else take up space that wasn't his to take. Evelyn nodded. Ah, Denise frowned. That's it. Ah? It's a common mistake, her grandmother said. People think betrayal only arrives with fireworks. They don't notice the quiet erosion. Denise leaned forward. How do you stop it? How do you even notice it's happening? Evelyn smiled faintly. You usually don't. That's why marriages don't end in one moment. They end in 1,000 small ones that went unaddressed. She stood and poured them both tea, the kettle whistling softly like punctuation. Your grandfather, Evelyn continued, handing Denise a cup, was a good man, still is. But he was not always attentive. Denise blinked. You never told me that. I didn't want you to think love meant ease, Evelyn said. It doesn't. It means vigilance. Denise wrapped her hands around the mug. Chris didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just held up a mirror. Evelyn nodded. That's a dangerous man. Denise looked up sharply. Dangerous. To complacency, Evelyn clarified. Men who shout give you something to push against. Men who stay calm make you confront yourself. Denise swallowed. He didn't ask me to stop, she said. He said he wanted me to understand why. That's because he wants your choice, not your compliance, Evelyn said. There's a difference. Denise stared into her tea. I didn't realize how entitled I'd become to his patience. Evelyn smiled, but there was no humor in it. Patience is not a bottomless well. It's a gift, one you refill by showing care. What if it's too late? Denise asked quietly. Evelyn considered her for a long moment. Has he left? She asked. No. Has he raised his voice? Called you names? No. Has he asked you to compete with someone else for his affection? No. Then it's not too late, Evelyn said. But it is time. Denise felt tears prick her eyes. Time for what? For accountability, her grandmother replied. Not apologies. Those are easy. Accountability is changing your behavior without needing applause. Denise nodded slowly. You don't protect a relationship by cutting out everyone else, Evelyn continued. You protect it by being aware of what belongs to the two of you and guarding it deliberately. Denise thought of Chris in the guest room, of the space he'd created not to punish her, but to remain whole. I treated something shared like it was mine alone, she said. Evelyn reached across the small table and squeezed her hand. Now you know better. Denise stayed for another hour, listening, absorbing, letting decades of hard-won wisdom settle into her bones. When she finally stood to leave, she felt steadier, not absolved, but oriented. That night, back at the apartment, the guest room door was closed. Denise stood outside it for a long moment, then walked to the couch instead. She didn't knock. She didn't demand reassurance. She texted Evan instead. Denise, I need to step back. This crossed a line I didn't see until now. Take care. She didn't wait for a response. She muted the conversation and set the phone face down. In the quiet that followed, she realized something important. Repair didn't start with convincing Chris of anything. It started with changing the way she occupied the space they shared. Tomorrow she would talk to him not to promise but to own. And she knew now how to do that without excuses. Chapter 6. Accounting. Chris noticed the change on the third day. Not because Denise announced it. Not because she sat him down and promised anything. She didn't. That was the point. It showed up in absences. Her phone stayed face down on the counter during dinner. When it buzzed, she glanced at it, then kept talking. When it buzzed again, she didn't reach for it at all. At first, Chris assumed it was temporary, the way people behaved right after conflict, when intention was sharp and resolve was loud. He didn't comment. He didn't reward it with praise. He simply observed. That had always been his way. On Thursday morning, he left the guest room door open when he went to work. It wasn't an invitation. It was an adjustment. Space recalibrated. Denise noticed. She didn't say anything. That evening, she came home with groceries, things he liked, things she usually forgot. The good pasta. The olive oil he preferred. The coffee beans from the place across town instead of the generic brand. It wasn't grand. It was specific. They cooked together without forcing conversation, moving around each other with the ease of shared history. When Chris reached for a pan, Denise stepped aside automatically. When she dropped a spoon, he handed her another without comment. Normal, but not careless. After dinner, Denise cleared the table while Chris wiped down the counters. When she finished, she sat on the couch, hands folded loosely in her lap. "I want to tell you something," she said. Chris dried his hands and joined her, leaving space between them, not as a barrier, but as a choice. "I ended it," she said. "The texting, the conversations." He nodded once. "Okay. I didn't do it for you," she added quickly. "I did it because I finally understood what I was doing." He studied her face, looking for urgency, for defensiveness. He found neither. "That matters," he said. She exhaled, some of the tension draining from her shoulders. "I didn't realize how easy it is to mislabel attention as harmless when you feel secure." "Security isn't immunity," Chris replied. She nodded. "I learned that." Silence settled, not heavy, just present. "I'm not asking you to come back to the bedroom yet," she said. "I don't want to rush past this." Chris felt something shift in his chest. Respect, recognized. "I appreciate that," he said. Later that night, alone in the guest room, Chris stared at the ceiling and took stock. He'd expected to feel vindicated, or relieved, or victorious in some quiet way. He didn't. What he felt was cautious. Trust wasn't restored by declarations. It was rebuilt the way wealth was built, incrementally with consistency, through repeated decisions that favored the long view over the short rush. He could do cautious. The next morning, Denise poured him coffee without being asked and slid the mug across the counter. "Meeting day?" she asked. "Yeah. Good luck." No probing. No tension. At work, Melissa eyed him over her lunch container. "You look steadier," she said. "I am," Chris replied. "Resolution. Direction," he corrected. That evening, Denise surprised him. Not with flowers. Not with apologies. With a question. "Can we talk about what us looks like when we're not on autopilot?" she asked. Chris leaned back in his chair, considering. "I think that's the only version worth having," he said. She smiled. Not relieved. Not triumphant. Just honest. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt shared again. Not because the problem was solved, but because both of them were finally doing the math. Chapter 7. The Ask That Matters. The conversation Denise had been circling finally happened on a Sunday morning. The kind that arrived quietly and refused to be postponed any longer. Chris was at the table with his laptop open, coffee cooling beside him, reviewing numbers the way some people read the news, carefully, without drama. Denise watched him from the kitchen doorway for a long moment, steadying herself. "Can we sit for a minute?" she asked. He closed the laptop without hesitation. "Yeah." They moved to the couch, this time sitting closer, not touching, but no longer guarding the space between them like it might bite. "I've been thinking about what you said," Denise began. "About boundaries not being ultimatums." Chris nodded. "Okay. I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer is uncomfortable." He met her gaze. "I don't do comfortable." She smiled faintly. "I know." She took a breath. "What would have happened if I hadn't noticed? If I'd kept going the way I was?" Chris didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I would have kept paying attention," he said finally. "And when it became clear that my place in your focus had changed permanently, I would have left." Her chest tightened. "Without a fight?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I don't compete for space that's supposed to be shared," he said calmly. "And I don't stay where I'm tolerated instead of chosen." Denise swallowed. "You didn't tell me that." "I didn't need to," he replied. "The rule didn't change just because you hadn't tested it yet." She nodded slowly. "I didn't realize how much I'd taken your steadiness for granted." "That happens," Chris said. "Consistency is easy to mistake for permanence." She let out a shaky breath. "I don't want to live like that. I don't want to assume you'll always be there no matter how careless I get." Chris studied her face, searching for something beneath the words. "So what are you asking?" he said. "I'm asking if you still see a future with me." Denise said. Not because of our history. Not because it's familiar. But because you believe I can be deliberate with you. The apartment felt very still. I need to know what changes for you, she added quickly. Not what you forgive, but what you require. Chris leaned back, thoughtful. I require respect that doesn't need reminders, he said. I require honesty that isn't reactive. And I require that if something starts to pull you away from us, you talk to me before it grows teeth. Denise nodded, tears stinging her eyes. That's fair. I also need to say something, he continued. She braced herself. I didn't do what I did to teach you a lesson, he said. I did it to stay aligned with myself. I wasn't willing to shrink so you wouldn't feel uncomfortable. She met his gaze. I don't want you to. Silence stretched, different from before. Cleaner. Less afraid. I love you, Denise said. But I'm not asking you to take that on faith. I'm asking you to watch what I do. Chris felt something settle in his chest. Not certainty, but possibility. That's the right ask, he said. She let out a breath she'd been holding for weeks. Can I ask one more thing? She said. Go ahead. Will you come back to the bedroom? She asked. Not because everything's fixed, but because I don't want distance to become our new habit. Chris considered it. Yes, he said. As long as we don't pretend this didn't happen. She smiled, relieved and resolute. Deal. That night, when they lay side by side again, the closeness felt earned, not assumed. Chris stared at the ceiling, listening to Denise's breathing even out beside him. For the first time since the shift began, he felt something familiar return. Not comfort, trust in motion. Chapter 8, New Math, Old Jokes. They decided to renegotiate their rules on a Tuesday night, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays were practical. Tuesdays didn't pretend to be romantic. They got things done. Chris cooked. Denise sat at the counter, watching him move through the kitchen with familiar efficiency. Knife strokes even, movements unhurried. It struck her, not for the first time, that loving him had always meant loving the way he paid attention. When dinner was done and dishes stacked neatly to dry, Chris gestured toward the couch. Okay, he said. Let's make it explicit. Denise smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. They sat close enough that their knees touched. Neither pulled away. Rule 1, Chris said. If something starts to matter, it gets named. Denise nodded. Even if it feels awkward. Especially then. Rule 2, she added. Phones don't get to interrupt conversations unless something is actually on fire. Chris huffed a laugh. Define actually. Smoke, she said. Sirens. A text from your mother that starts with, don't panic. That's fair, he said. Rule 3, no secret spaces. She tilted her head. Meaning if either of us starts having conversations we wouldn't be comfortable summarizing out loud. That's the check engine light. Denise winced. Yeah, that one hit. They sat with that for a moment. Then she leaned back, studying him. Your turn to add something uncomfortable, she said. Chris thought. If I say something bothers me, I don't want to be told I'm overthinking. She nodded immediately. Deal. And if I say something feels off, I don't want you to assume I'm accusing you of something. Deal. They paused. This is very serious, Denise said. It is, Chris agreed. She grinned. Which is why I propose an equally serious rule. He raised an eyebrow. Go on. We're allowed to be ridiculous, she said. On purpose. If we lose that, none of this matters. Chris considered that, then nodded solemnly. I accept, on the condition that you never again mock my inability to sing. She laughed. I mock because I love. Threatening, he said, deadpan. Later that night, they lay in bed, Denise tracing idle shapes on his arm. Can I ask you something that's maybe too honest? She said. That's been the theme, Chris replied. Why didn't you just tell me sooner? She asked. When you first started feeling uneasy. He stared at the ceiling for a moment. Because I didn't want reassurance. I wanted respect. She was quiet, absorbing that. And you? He asked. Why didn't you notice sooner? Denise exhaled slowly. Because nothing bad was happening yet. And I confused nothing bad with nothing wrong. Chris turned toward her then, meeting her gaze. That's the difference between maintenance and repair, he said. One feels boring. The other hurts. She smiled faintly. I prefer boring. Same. They fell asleep like that, no grand declarations, no dramatic gestures. Just the quiet sense that the ground beneath them had been re-leveled. In the morning, Denise found Chris at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him. What's all this? She asked. He smiled, a little sheepish. I might have sketched out a plan. She blinked. A plan for what? For us, he said. Not timelines, just direction. Her chest warmed. You're ridiculous. I invest in what I believe in, he replied easily. She leaned down and kissed him. Soft, unhurried, certain. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something they were assuming. It felt like something they were actively choosing. Chapter 9, the question he chose. Chris didn't plan the proposal. That was the first thing that surprised him. He had always assumed, wrongly it turned out, that something so important would arrive with charts and timing and contingency plans. He planned everything else that way. Investments, career moves, long-term goals. He believed in preparation because preparation respected reality. But the question he'd been carrying didn't want spreadsheets. It wanted alignment. The realization came to him on an ordinary Thursday evening, while Denise sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting through a stack of old photos she'd pulled out of a drawer for no particular reason. She laughed at something she found. A terrible haircut, a half-finished apartment, a memory he'd forgotten existed. "Look at us," she said, holding up a photo from their first year together. "We thought we knew everything." Chris leaned over her shoulder. "We didn't even know what we didn't know." She smiled up at him. "We learned. That was it. Not a lightning strike. Not a cinematic swell. Just clarity." Later that night, after Denise had gone to bed, Chris sat at the kitchen table and opened the small box he'd kept tucked away for months. He hadn't bought the ring recently. He'd bought it when he still thought certainty came from time served instead of truth tested. He rolled it between his fingers, considering. Tomorrow, he decided. Not because tomorrow was special, because tomorrow was honest. The next evening, he suggested they take a walk after dinner. Denise raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. That too felt like progress. The air was cool, the neighborhood quiet in the way it only got after dusk. They walked side by side, hands brushing occasionally, neither in a hurry. At the small park a few blocks from their apartment, Chris stopped near a bench beneath an old tree whose branches had outlasted more than one generation of careful promises. "Can we sit?" he asked. Denise smiled. "You're being suspiciously formal." "Occupational hazard," he said. They sat. The moment stretched, not tense, just anticipatory. "I used to think proposing meant everything was perfect," Chris said finally. "That it was a reward for getting it right." Denise tilted her head, listening. "I don't believe that anymore," he continued. "I think it's a decision to keep choosing each other, even after you've seen the parts that could break you if you let them." Her chest tightened. "I won't promise perfection," he said. "I won't promise we won't screw things up sometimes. What I will promise is that I won't stay silent when something matters, and I won't disappear when it gets hard." Denise's eyes glistened. "Chris, I love you," he said simply, "and I respect you, and I want to keep building this life with you, with rules we both honor." He reached into his pocket and opened the box. "So," he said, steady and sure, "will you marry me?" Denise didn't answer right away. She laughed, a soft, disbelieving sound, and covered her mouth with her hand. Tears slipped free anyway. "Yes," she said, voice breaking. "Yes, of course, yes." Chris exhaled, something deep and long held finally releasing. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like a beginning, one chosen with eyes open. Later, back at the apartment, Denise leaned against him, tracing the ring absently. "You know," she said, "this isn't a happily ever after." "No," Chris agreed. "It's better." She smiled, happily aware. He laughed. "I'll take it." As they turned out the lights and settled into bed, Chris thought about all the things he'd built carefully over the years. Accounts balanced, risks calculated, futures secured. This, he knew, was his best investment yet. Not because it was safe, but because it was honest.